I am Marc Daniel Nelson. I am a producer, mixer, creative director, and I am here at Calhoun Studios in Los Angeles, California. Back in 2000, I started as an assistant engineer at a real studio at that era where there was, a lot of players playing live together, and that stuff was great. But what they were starting to see was the industry was kind of shifting a little bit. And I had a mentor who had a son that was a director in commercials. He was also a screenwriter, and I always got into that too. So I went to film school separately, graduated from film school, moved to Los Angeles, worked under Bill Schnee at that time, fully immersed back into music. I caught a lot of videos at that time, way before YouTube. There was a series called Classic Records, and it was a documentary series with classic historical albums of making those albums in the studio. And I always thought if there's a way to combine those two things, documentary making and classic recording studios, that would be the best job ever. So I think that was the catalyst to kind of get into that universe. I'm a mixer for normal albums, but also in television and film. Just try to stay creative. We just kind of have to cut what we can into our lives to keep consistent work. So sometimes I'll wake up and I know I'm mixing an album or doing a recall on this project. Tomorrow might be completely different. And then the next day I might be a creative director leading a video series or something, a concert thing, separate, completely out of mixing. I just kind of see it all as creative. At least the people I knew growing up, when I started as an assistant, you kind of left that area when you became a producer or an engineer. You would stay in different genres. You become a rock guy and you stay in that area. I was taught early to kind of use every skill you can to learn all different styles of music. By doing that, you're kind of cross-platforming, doing music one day, doing videos the other day, mixing a score from a movie one day, or recording drums for a rock record the other day. I still think if you go into it knowing that you understand where you're at, you're going to have a lot better leeway than most people, because you're not only pigeoning yourself down to one little thing. I do believe that it's critically important in 2026 to just have your hands in as many little things as you can, just to stay busy. In mixing, again, for me, I do like certain things to become quick. So like I will use a template that I've been using for a long time, and some people say, well, you're losing the charm of that. I will say, but it's giving me more time to be able to focus on things like reverbs or really diving into certain plugins. Going back to the Spiff plugin, that was an accident find. I don't know a lot of people that knew much about it a couple years ago, and now it's definitely one of my top favorite plugins of all time. And that only would have happened if I had time to spare versus time to deal with other things. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. Spiff has been one of those few plugins that I love compression, but finding elements of compression that I like that's hyper focused, Spiff can do really well. In digital technology, you definitely have a sharper transient than you would in an analog. I mean, that's the cool thing about being inside a computer, is you're getting a really good representation of the track. But when you're building something like the thing I'm about to play, it's such a hassle to have certain transient things stick out. I've always been a fan of using kind of flicky, transient plugins to get percussive elements and stuff to poke. But what I found is those, even though they have selectable frequency areas, you can't really pinpoint it. And then you're ended up getting things to sound small, or it's just getting eaten up by the limiter. The thing with Spiff that I like extremely well is you can really use it as a target zone and get something only in 100 hertz. Let's say the snare drum. You get the mix perfect, everything is so great, but after you have the limiter on and you're listening to it as a whole, you're just missing that little bit of poke in the kick drum. If you added EQ, it's not gonna add that. If you add compression, it's gonna kill the kick drum. But if you do that target thing in Spiff, that I'll show you a few, you're zoning in on like 110, which is not even the fundamental I like on the kick drum, but it just adds that little puff point. It does it so effortlessly and naturally on the top of it, it just sounds better. Soothe is interesting because it was like the first plugin that people really started understanding aliasing in digital is a problem. Being a score mixer, I get a lot of sample-based instruments too, connected to real things. So I will get like a 30-piece real orchestra, and then they will add woodwinds and brass that are samples. Even the best samples, there's things that are just a little funky when it comes to aliasing and harshness in certain areas. And we used to do multi-band EQ and all these things to kind of tame that, but then you would hear it would be ducking and stuff. When Soothe came out, just in that in general, even like IR guitars and just stuff like that, they just have these weird aliasing. It just instantly took it away. But like anything good, you gotta be very cautious. What I've noticed in getting projects into mix and stuff, everyone loves it to the point where they're probably going too far. So there is that sweet spot. Obviously in vocals, it works extremely well. It's its own style of de-essing. Obviously there's all different types of de-essing. There's all these issues going on in like the weird gargle area of a throat. I would say 200 hertz to 300 where it just gets all this buildup that just tames that as well too. I haven't experimented too much on the sharpness, but you can tell when you start boosting stuff like that, it can get away from you really quickly. So like anything, you just gotta be really cautious. Something I'm gonna show you in a few minutes is the rule of 5%. And in critical listening, which is something that I've spent my entire life basing everything around, it's like my Bible. You get more out of making 5% moves than you do 20%. And when you start adding all those things up, you start seeing it. Being very cautious with how you apply things like that, with Spiff, with Soothe, and Bloom, if you can understand to get down to that 5%, you're in the win. Because if you start adding on top of that, you're actually getting more out of it. I've said this 20 times over the last 5 years. That last 5% of the 95% to get to 100 is way bigger than the first 95%. If you start applying that to engineering and how you process things with EQ, and it's not being conservative, because you can certainly get aggressive for creativity. But if you're making smaller moves and people are feeling like it's not aggressive enough, you start adding in layers those 5%, you just get way more out of it. Going back to critical listening, you have to kind of pinpoint what you're hearing. You start getting into that headspace, you're going to start making better moves. What I learned early on was you just start treating certain instruments very similar. So if I'm listening to a mix and there's S's going on, I'm focusing on the S's. And then there's cymbals, and then there's the top part of the snare. Those should all relatively be around the same area. Now, if one is a little louder than the other, same as acoustic guitar. And I'll show you actually a cool trick I did on this track too, where I can tame a little bit of the top of that acoustic so it blends in with the actual percussion. You start balancing those things together. When you lock the mix in and you go to mastering and you need to make the whole track brighter, you can lift the whole thing and everything comes with it. Now, if you had, let's say, the vocal S's louder than the hi-hat and cymbals, then when you lift it up, that vocal is just going to get as loud. But if you relatively focus on these areas of different instruments together, when you can make global moves, which is what I really like to do more than instrumental smaller moves, I like to make group moves because it just seems to sit better with mixes. It just makes things a little more tasteful and more pleasing. Yeah, I know there's a lot of people 5 or so years ago that was really pushing you to get away from using your eyes when you're mixing, turn off your monitor, and that's great, but I think if you can get past that and understand what it's doing, the visual side is important. With your guys' plugin, you make it really simple to see, oh God, what's going on at 200 hertz? Something's funky there. Or why is it doing that? If you have 5 different monitors, it might sound great on big ones versus small ones. You just have to trust what you're hearing. So if it's only headphones, that's the only thing you have to use, just start listening to product that you really know. I know everyone talks about that, but really start understanding, okay, this is the yes issue I'm talking about. This is the cymbal issue I'm talking about. You start understanding that. And if it becomes fatiguing, take a break. Because you'll take 15 minutes, go outside, walk in a circle. I like to keep like a little old movie going on with no volume. I can literally look at it for 2 minutes and then come back, and it's just like a palate cleanser. This song is called Arizona by the artist Jeremiah Jones, produced by a great producer in Nashville named Andrew Berg. The reason why we chose this song today is because I'm using quite a bit of Spiff on this project. Spiff by Oak Sound is my favorite plugin of theirs, more than Soothe. I know a lot of people like Soothe and that's a big popular thing, but I don't think enough people actually listen to what Spiff offers. And I'll tell you why I'm a big fan of it. And it's not just, in my opinion, a transient shaper. The reason why, and this was an accident I pulled up on a song that was given to me to mix, it had it on the drum bus. It just does something so unique compared to most plug-in transient shapers. The thing it does remind me of, so close to the hardware, is that very first punch in the transients. That high frequency punch you get out of really nice compressors that adds that kind of flick sound. I love it on drums. I love it on bass guitar. It just seems to help things really sit nicely and kind of poke through on very dense material. This track, there's a lot going on. There's a lot of drums kind of constantly circulating. The bass is playing 8th to 16ths. There's just an ambience of total noise. And by adding a little flavor on the kick and the snare and the bass, you're just getting a tiny bit more punch and response out of that. Spiff being a cool plugin that it's a full frequency bass where you can really solo in the areas, allows you to really get in and get your hands dirty. So let's take a listen to it.
On this Arizona autumn morning, through the cactus stands, you can almost see the angels dancing on the ledge. The canyons yawning and over.
Now, a big ask Andrew had while he was producing this was he wanted the drums to have a very alive sound. Kept referencing like Fleetwood Mac and stuff where the drums were sticking out but still sounded glued. And the issue I hear in modern day recordings a lot is kind of a lot of aggressive 2-bus compression on the drums and then smearing the whole thing like a sandwich at the end. That's okay too, but what Spiff allows you to do is just pull out the areas you want without having to over compress it. So I'm a huge fan of compression on drums. It obviously adds a lot of excitement, a lot of punch, but sometimes it's just way too much. So the thing with Spiff that I love is I can really zone in and focus on, let's just say the snare drum here, right around 120, that meat, that pump, it really comes out. So I'll accentuate that a little bit and I'll bring a little bit out around 4 to 5K too, just to get some of that flick. So let me solo the kick drum and just show you a little bit about this. The kick drum for me, the meat and potatoes is everything from 40 hertz to 110. Usually though, when I'm EQing a kick drum, I like to kind of start scooping around 150 down all the way up to around 300 just to get some of that muck out. Here, if you can see, we're bringing up this whole area. Just because you're bringing up the area doesn't mean it's like amplifying that frequency dependent area. I think the way that this works is it's more dependent on the material. So for this song, if I'm just listening to the kick drum without, it's already has enough tone, shape, and punch to it. But what I would like to get out of it without adding compression is just a little more punch and a tiny bit of the attack. So if you look at the screen, this is with off. It's still going to emphasize things like I'm dipping around 900 here. That's just accentuating it down to not kind of bring it up. So for the kick, really all I'm doing is adding some of the bottom of it. So here's without. And then I'll bring in with. Now again, it's subtle. Most of the things I do, it's really subtle changes. If I can get 5% better, I'm good with that. This is just adding a little expansion on the bottom of the kick and putting the kick and snare together. If I pull these together, you'll see my focus point on the snare drum is similar to the kick, but I'm also adding a little bit around 4K. Now, if I do the delta on the snare, you can hear what it's actually accentuating on the snare. It's just a little bit of a flick. That's just adding a little more transient. And when you're in a dense mix, it's really pulling the drums out. I'm going to solo just the drums by itself. We can listen to it with both the spiff on the kick and snare and then without. Here's without. Again, it's already balanced, it sounds pretty good, but if you start adding a tiny bit more punch to the areas we were talking about in the kick and snare, you're just adding a little bit more life. And we all know when we face that limiter at the very end to try to get loudness, all that goes away. If you start listening to how that's reacting to the brick wall limiter, it actually accentuates and kind of pushes through so you can hear it with the volume you're trying to get with like a very loud mix. So here's without, and here's with it. It's actually almost creating a little carving, almost like an EQ as well, where you're not using compression, you're not using an EQ, but you're accentuating transient and the response to that to be able to get the kick and snare to sit in their own pocket. So here's without again. And with. If you're listening on headphones, you can really hear that bloom of that kick start posting. One thing to notice on the settings, you see the sensitivity and the decay. These are the same, and I've chose that because I wanted to make sure as a drum set, you want to hear the drums as a set. I get really cautious about doing too much moves when you're knowing that the drum set is a whole instrument. Now, you can obviously make things different with EQ and compression, but I kind of kept the sensitivity and decay as almost like a safe haven, very similar to just keep it tight and punchy. Let's listen to the bass guitar. Now on bass, on its own, I also have another Spiff. For me, the bass guitar, all the movement and the stuff you hear is right around 800 hertz. And by adding a little bit of Spiff boost on that, and I've kind of adjusted the decay and sensitivity to taste, I'm getting a little more finger punch without that harsh honkiness you get when you add too much EQ on a bass guitar. One thing to add real quickly is we're not cutting anything. The things with the bands we're using where it's kind of sloping like this, we're just targeting the area we want. I think that's the best description we can add. Let's listen without first. As you can already tell, the bass guitar already has quite a bit of percussive punch to it. But again, because it's such a dense mix, I just like to hear a little more punch out of that 800 to 1000 area where we're targeting. So this is with it. It's just pulling a little bit of that area up. Now, if we go into Delta mode, you'll be able to hear that you're just focusing on that area. And like EQ, if you just added 800, a bell at, 800, 4 dB, it's going to sound okay, but you're going to start getting squawks and stuff. This seems to only grab the areas you want. And a lot of guys that I've been mixing for over the last 2 years have always asked, can you put that Spiff on the bass? Just instinctively, because I did it like on one track or something. And they always go, well, what did you do on that bass guitar? And I had to go back and found that this is what it usually is doing. It's adding just a little bit more thrust and punch to that without adding too much compression or too much EQ noise. And it's been in my template ever since. Moving down the line, the next thing we have is the acoustic guitar. The way it came in, I believe Andrew recorded them on his iPhone because that was a specific sound. Those compression artifacts on iPhones had this really aggressive, punchy thing already. I liked that sound, but what it was doing was becoming a little too annoying when you're putting in, let's say, the percussion loop and then the whole drums itself. So I just wanted to tame just the high frequencies of the acoustic guitar. So if I open up the acoustic guitar here in Spiff, you'll see, again, I'm targeting everything above 8K, and I'm cutting. What this is doing is just dampening that area, just tapering it off, but in a very, very tasteful way. And the one thing that this company does so well is just create things that just sound musical. So this is out. And this is in. It's not really taking away from the instrument or the character of the sound. It's just taming that little aggressive area without actually doing it with a multiband compressor. It's softening it in a very different way. And again, if you look at my sensitivity and my decay, I've adjusted that to taste. I've kept the oversampling in this off because that actually has a sound of its own too. So you can play with those settings and try to figure out what works best for you. So let's listen to this in Delta mode. Now it's really subtle, it's really flicky, it's, pretty high up there. I probably can't even hear above 8K, to be honest, after all these years of listening too loud. But I know it's there because I can see it. So you got to trust it. But it does fight with it too. When I take this and I solo the drums together and the bass, and I just listen to this together. I have Spiff on the drums and the bass. I have the cut on the Spiff on the acoustic guitar. If I take Spiff out on the acoustic guitar, just listen to the top of the acoustic and how it's fighting with the drums a little bit now. All that air on the acoustic is kind of now above the drums. It's not gluing. Now it's pulling it down. It's allowing the percussion to kind of fill up the remaining area. Now the wild card on this session is the Soothe 2 on the background vocals. If I solo the stem without it, it's a lot. It's very glassy sounding, it's very punchy and bright, and at times a little harsh. What we're doing is kind of scooping out some of that harsh resonance. We're targeting around 4K, and it's starting to pull a little bit that down. With it out,
Arizona, autumn morning, through
literally a wall of sound.
you can almost see the
Pulling in Soothe 2, I kept it all the way down to 125 because I wanted it to tame some of that too as it's going. But the target area is 5, which is usually the S's and stuff like that.
on this Arizona autumn.
My attack is at 1. My release is at fast because I want it to be very responsive. And it's essentially the sharpness is at right at 11 o'clock. And as a song, that is pretty much it. If I open up everything and I play the chorus, I take Soothe out. You're getting a little bit of the S's, and it's kind of fighting, kind of like what the acoustic guitar was doing. But since the acoustic guitar is percussive, that other half of cutting on Spiff really works well versus doing a Soothe thing, resonant fixer. Because this is smoother, the vocals are more blocky. Just tames it so much nicer. And that is, in a nutshell, the song. Thanks for listening. I am Marc Daniel Nelson. I am a producer, mixer, creative director. Thank you guys on behalf of OX Sound. Thank you for having me. Please keep up the great work.